Hi folks, this is Nicholas Hamawi from AGI Training for Microsoft. In this screencast, I'm going to be covering how to access local and network resources in Windows 7. More specifically, I'm going to cover file and folder permissions, encrypting files and folders with EFS, access to shared resources including folders, printers, and using HomeGroup. Also, configuring user account control, methods of authentication and authorization, including certificates and smart cards, and finally a quick overview of Windows 7 BranchCache. Okay, I'm on my Windows 7 desktop. Now let's talk about file and folder permissions. I'm going to open up a Windows Explorer window and go to my C drive. Now I've created a folder called ABC. Now let's say I want specific control over who has access to this folder. What you have to do is right-click on the folder and then choose Properties, and then open the Security panel. In the Security panel, there are two main sections, a list of group or usernames and a list of permissions. You can edit either of these. To edit the groups or usernames, click the Edit button. Now, as a default, since I created this folder off the root of the C drive, the following groups and users were granted access to this folder. Now let's say I don't want anybody but myself to have access to this folder. What you want to do is remove some of these groups and usernames. But in order to do that, you have to remove inherited permissions. So let's go back to the previous panel and then choose the Advanced button in the Security panel. As you can see here, there's a checkbox next to Include Inheritable Permissions from the object's parent. The object's parent of this folder is the C drive. That means that whatever permissions have been granted to the C drive have been granted to this folder. But we need to override that, so click on Change Permissions and then uncheck Include Inheritable Permissions from this object's parent. Now at this point you have a choice. You can either explicitly define the permissions that were previously inherited, that way they're bound to the ABC folder directly, or you can completely remove all of the inherited permissions and start with no inherited permissions. I'm going to choose the Add option. At this point, we can choose to remove certain users and groups from the permissions list of this folder. So again, my goal here is to create a folder that only I have access to. So I'm going to remove administrators, and then users, and then authenticated users. And I'm going to add myself. The way to do that is to type in your fully qualified username. That starts with your PC name, and then a backslash, and then your username. If you're on a domain, then you'll definitely want to include your domain name here instead. After you're done typing it, click Check Names. That validates that you've typed in the name correctly. Then click OK. Now we can choose exactly what permissions I want to have on this folder. Since I'm the owner, I want full control. So just click the full control check mark, and all of the other ones will be checked automatically. Then click OK. Now back in the Security panel, I can now see that only System and myself have access to this folder, and I have full rights. Now just to be sure no other user has any access to this folder, I can do an explicit check. You do that by clicking on Advanced, and then open up the Effective Permissions panel. Here you can enter the name of another user by clicking the Select button. Now I'm going to type the fully qualified name of the user that I want to check. So type the name in and then choose Check Names. Now that Check Names has validated the existence of the account, I can check OK, and then I can read the permissions of this particular user. And as you can see here, he has no permissions whatsoever. Now let's create a file in this folder. In this file, I'm going to put some private information, like my phone number. And then I'm going to save it. But let's say you're still not satisfied with the safety of this folder, and you really want to make sure that nobody can read its contents. Well, there's one more step you can take with Windows 7. You can right-click on this file, and then choose Properties, and then choose Advanced. And in the Advanced panel, you can choose to encrypt this folder. Simply check Encrypt Contents to Secure Data, and then click OK. And click OK again. At this point, you're warned that it's possible that the software you're using may create a second copy of your file which will not be automatically encrypted. the way around this is to encrypt the folder itself. Windows 7 gives you that option by default at this point. Normally for very sensitive data, I suggest you choose this default option. As you can see here, the file name is changed to a green color. That reminds you that this file is encrypted. The beauty of the way Windows 7 handles file encryption is that it's completely seamless. If I want to view this file again, I simply double-click it and edit it and save it as I would a normal file. Windows 7 takes care of all the decryption and encryption in the background. So you can be sure that even if another user was able to see this file listed in the directory listing, they wouldn't be able to actually open it. But keep in mind, this feature is only available in Windows 7 Professional, Enterprise, and Ultimate editions. Now let's say I wanted to move or copy this file to another folder. What I'm going to do here is take advantage of the beautiful new feature of Windows 7 docking. And then I'm going to open up another window and dock it to the right-hand side. Now let's start with copying this file to a different location on the same volume. So from the C:\ABC folder, I'm going to move it to another folder. First, let's create that other folder. And I'm going to resort my folders. And I'm now going to drag a copy of this file to the new folder. Now let's double-click that folder and look at the file. As you can see, the file is still green, which means the file is still encrypted. However, let's take a look at the permissions. As you can see here, the file has inherited the permissions from the new folder to which it was copied to. This is one of the reasons why it's important to use the Encrypting File System feature if you're really concerned about other users reading your files. If you inadvertently copy your file to another folder, you're still protected. Now if I copy that file to a separate volume altogether, in this case my USB drive, you can see that it still retains the encryption. And if I right-click and choose Properties, Security, unfortunately everybody has access to this file now. Okay, so how do I get around that issue? So let's go back to the original file. Right-click it and then choose Properties, then Security, and then Advanced, and then change permissions. This time I'm not going to inherit permissions from the folder. Instead I'm going to explicitly define it. And again I'm going to choose Add to copy the existing permissions. Now the permissions are explicitly defined for this file. So let's try this again. Let's copy this file to the other folder. And then let's open the other folder, right-click and choose Properties, and then Security. Same problem. However, let's delete this file now. This time we're going to move it to the new folder. And then I'm going to right-click and choose Properties and Security. And you can see this time it has retained my permissions. Now let's try that with my offline storage. Right-click, Properties, and still everyone has access. So there's a very important distinction here. So long as the security is applied directly to the file, if you move that file onto the same volume, those security settings will be retained. However, if you copy that file to any other location on your drive, or move that file to a different volume, those settings will not be retained. So the moral of the story here is, when you're setting file and folder permissions, be extremely careful with what permissions you're using, how they're applied, and where you plan on moving or copying those files to. Again, for extra security, it's always good to use the Encrypting File System feature. Or as an alternative, use BitLocker, which was introduced with Windows Vista, and BitLocker to Go, which works with external drives and was introduced with Windows 7. Okay, now let's talk about sharing files and folders. What I've done is I created a new folder called abc-share. This is the folder I want to share with my colleagues. I can do that by right-clicking on it and choosing Share With, and then choose either Nobody or Specific People. Here's where you can type in the name of a person. To be sure that you're typing it in correctly, you can choose Find People. So what I'm going to do here is type in the fully qualified name of the person who I want to share this with. And then I can choose Share. However, before I do that, I want to mention that oftentimes choosing everyone is not a bad idea for a share. The way you can actually restrict people is by setting the security on the folder, as I had just detailed. The important thing to note is that when you're sharing a folder, there are security settings for both the share itself and for the folder. The overall effective permissions for that share are based on the tighter security rules. So for example, if only John and Nick are allowed access to this share, but in the security panel for the folder itself, everyone is allowed access, so long as I'm accessing that folder through the share, only John and Nick will have access. Conversely, if I were to select that everyone has access to the share, but then restrict the security of the folder itself to Nick and John, then ultimately nobody will be able to have access to the folder except Nick and John, whether they're accessing it through the share or directly on the computer. I find it much easier to select everyone on the share and then specify the specific security settings in the folder itself. Now this folder is shared, and other people on other computers, so long as they've been granted access, can map a drive letter to this share. Or they can access the share directly without even mapping a drive letter. If you want to customize the sharing properties, you can right-click on the folder, then choose Properties, and then go to the Sharing panel. Now there are two buttons here. The first button brings you back to where we just were. But in the Advanced Sharing panel, you can do things like changing the name of the share, or even adding a new name for the share, and you can also customize the permissions from here directly. Okay, so how about sharing printers or other hardware devices? Well, the easiest way to do that is to go to the Network and Sharing Center. The quickest way to the Network and Sharing Center is to go to the network connection icon in your task tray, and then left-click on it, and choose Open Network and Sharing Center. And then you can choose the Change Advanced Sharing Settings. Now, depending on what profile you're logged in with, will determine which section is expanded. As you can see here, I'm currently logged in with my domain profile. So under the domain profile, I have a number of options. I can turn on and off network discovery, and when it's turned on, I can see other computers and devices on the network, and they can see my computer as well. I can also turn on and off file and printer sharing, and I can turn on and off the sharing of information in my public folders. There's even some media streaming options that you can take advantage of. That way you can share pictures, music, and videos with other people on your network. Scrolling further down, you also have the option to set up encryption for all shared content. So if you've turned on network discovery and file and printer sharing, when you open up Windows Explorer and you expand networks, you'll be able to see all the other computers and devices on your network. And if you turn on public folder sharing, you'll see that under your documents, music, pictures, and videos, you have public folders. These are the folders that you want to place content in if you want to share with other people on your network. But let's head back to the Network and Sharing Center. One thing that's actually going to make it a lot easier to share content on your network is to enable something called HomeGroup. HomeGroup is new to Windows 7. Normally you would see a HomeGroup link right here in this area, but since I'm joined to the domain, it's not available. So let me switch over to a computer that's not joined to a domain. On this computer, here's the HomeGroup link I was referring to. Joining a HomeGroup is very simple. You just click the Available to Join link. Or if a home group has not already been created on your network, you would have the option to create one. To join the home group, just click the Join Now button, and then choose what you want to share with the rest of the group, and click the Next button. Then you need to type in the password to the home group. The first computer on your network that created the home group was the one that received the password. So after you've typed your password, just click Next. And there we go, we've joined the home group. Just open up Windows Explorer and you'll see a home group section. Under the home group section, you'll find the list of computers that have joined the home group and are currently available. If you click on one of these computers, you'll see what they are sharing on the home group, such as documents, pictures, music, and videos. You can also expand the home group computer like any other folder. One of the things that's different about the home group as compared to the previous sharing method I showed you is that the home group exposes all folders under documents, music, pictures, and videos, not just the public folders. However, you can only write to the public folders. Now let's head back over to the other computer and talk about user account control settings. User account control limits the privileges that applications have on your system. It basically forces applications to run with standard user privileges, even if you're logged in as an administrator. To force an application to run as an administrator, you have to right-click on the application and then choose Run as Administrator. If you're finding user account control slightly inconvenient, you can fine-tune the way that it behaves. The easiest way to do that is to go to the Start menu and type in UAC. That brings up the Change User Account Control settings. This is where you can essentially choose your comfort level with user account control. The default is to notify you only when programs try to make changes to your computer. Specifically, not to notify you when you make changes yourself. At the most secure level, Windows will always notify you whether you or an application tries to make those changes. Scrolling down to the position below the default position, you'll have an option that is identical to the default position, except that you won't be notified on the secure desktop. We'll talk about secure desktop in a moment. The problem with this setting is that certain malicious applications can prevent you from seeing the notification. However, there may be a slight performance improvement for some users in case it takes a long time to dim the desktop. That's because this setting does not dim the desktop, as does the default setting. Going down to the least secure position, you won't receive notification at all when applications make changes to your computer. This particular setting is only useful for applications that don't support Windows 7 user account control. However, I highly recommend that you keep this tab in the default position. In situations where you need to run applications that don't support user account control, I recommend using Compatibility Mode or running that application as administrator instead. For example, if I wanted to run this application in Compatibility Mode, I can right-click on it, choose Properties, then go to the Compatibility panel, enable Run this program in Compatibility Mode, and then choose the operating system that I want to emulate. Operating systems from Windows 95 up through Windows Server 2003 don't have user account control, so you can choose any one of those settings in case you have a specific application that doesn't work as a result of user account control. Of course, you'd want to choose the operating system that is most compatible with that application. And again, the other method is to run that specific application as an administrator. You do that by right-clicking and choosing Run as Administrator. That way, only that application has special privileges, and not all applications. Okay, so I mentioned Secure Desktop. What is Secure Desktop? If you try to run an application with privileges, and I'll do that by right-clicking on this application and choosing Run as Administrator, you'll see that the rest of the desktop becomes dim and disabled. I can't click on anything. That's what Secure Desktop is. As you recall in the user account control settings, if I move it to the position just below the default position, the Secure Desktop will be turned off. Again, the problem is that a malicious program, because it won't be disabled, can manually click this Yes button on your behalf to allow a certain program to run. That's why I suggest keeping Secure Desktop enabled and using the default position in User Account Control. Okay, now let's talk about authentication and authorization. There's a big difference between the two. Authentication is the process of determining that you are who you say you are. Windows performs authentication, for example, by asking you for your username and password, since you're supposed to be the only one who knows that. Authorization, on the other hand, is determining what you have access to. For example, a network share. In order to be authenticated to a system, Windows needs to identify your credentials and then map them to the resources that you have access to. Windows 7 gives you convenient ways of managing your credentials to other computer systems. One of the ways is through the Credential Manager. You can get to the Credential Manager by going to the Start menu and then going to the Control Panel and then choosing Credential Manager. Now I don't have any credentials configured here, but let's switch over to my other computer where I do. As you can see here, there are three different types of credentials that Windows can track for you: Windows credentials, certificate-based credentials, and generic credentials. Since I'm joined to a home group and there are two other computers on that home group, Windows 7 has already added my credentials for those other two computers under the Windows Credentials section. You can expand them by clicking on the down arrow. In the details, you can see the computer that I have access to, the username under which I have access to it, and the password. I can add other credentials for other Windows computers by clicking here, and then manually typing in the computer name or internet address, the username, and the password. By entering the credentials here, the next time I visit that computer, I won't be prompted for the credentials. They will be inserted for me automatically. Under generic credentials, you could add credentials for websites that you commonly visit. For example, I've added one for my LinkedIn account. To add a generic credential, just click the Add a Generic Credential link, and then type in the internet or network address, username, and password. The final credential area is a certificate-based credential. To add a certificate-based credential, click this link, and then choose the internet or network address of the computer or server that you want to have access to. Once you've entered the address, then you can select a certificate to apply to that address. Now, in order for this to work, you need to store your certificates on a smart card. Normally, smart cards are issued to you in an enterprise environment and provided to you by your company. However, there are third-party companies that do provide smart cards directly to end users. You'll just need to make sure that your smart card meets ISO 7816 standards. You'll also need a smart card reader. Many notebook computers these days come automatically with smart card readers built in. The beauty of a smart card is that it can store your certificates, which safely store your credentials in a manner that nobody else can read. Smart cards generally require a PIN number in order to access them. After a small number of wrong attempts on that PIN number, the smart card is rendered useless. A smart card is exactly credit card sized and contains a microprocessor and memory on it. It's literally a computer on a card. Smart cards have the ability to encrypt and store certificates and passwords so that only you have access to them. If your computer is joined to a domain and your domain is set up with smart card certificate services, you can log into Windows directly with your smart card. In fact, through the appropriate group policy settings, you can enforce that all users log in only with their smart card. You could also set up policies such that when the smart card is removed, the computer is automatically locked. So getting back to this window here, if you have a smart card with the appropriate certificate on it, you need to insert your smart card at this time and then choose OK. To manage your certificates, you can click on Open the Certificate Manager. In the Certificate Manager, you'll find your personal certificates, such as mine here, and a listing of your trusted root certificate authorities, such as my domain certificate authority, and there's a long list that are already configured for you as well. So how do you get and install a certificate? Well, again, your domain has to be set up to provide one, and normally your network administrator will enroll you and provide you with a smart card or certificate that you can install on your computer. Let me give you an example. You do that by going to your certificate server, which is always the name of the server followed by /cert srv. And the reason I'm getting this message is because that particular certificate server is not yet entered as a trusted certificate authority, but I'm just going to click continue. And then I'm going to provide my administrator credentials. Again, normally you wouldn't be doing this yourself. Now I'm going to request a certificate. In this case, I want to request a smart card certificate. So under the certificate template, I'm going to choose smart card user. And then I'm going to keep the default settings and then choose submit. And at this point, I can save and install the certificate. In case this was the first time you've installed that particular certificate, you would have also had the option to save it first. And with the appropriate software and drivers for your smart card, you can then install that certificate directly on your smart card. You'll need to consult your smart card documentation or get documentation from your administrator on exactly how to do that. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I just placed this certificate on my desktop. So if I double click it, I can see the certificate that was assigned to me. I can get details on that certificate. And I can see the certificate path as well. And that was from my Enterprise Certificate Authority that I have previously created. So going back to the General panel, I can install the certificate from here. And that brings up an installation wizard. In the second panel of the installation wizard, I can choose to automatically select the certificate store based on the type of certificate, or I can force the certificate to be placed in a particular store. And then finally click Finish to confirm. Once the certificate has been properly installed in the Certificate Manager and optionally copied to my smart card, I no longer need the certificate file. Getting back to smart cards, I wanted to mention one more thing. Smart cards provide a means of multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication means that two or more methods of authentication are used. This is in contrast with single-factor authentication, such as a username and password. A username and password is simply something that you know. This type of information is not easily kept secure. It's especially insecure since many users choose passwords that are easy to guess. But with multi-factor authentication, in addition to using something that you know, you can use something that you have. For example, a smart card. In other words, in order for it to work, you must know the key to the smart card and you must possess the smart card itself. This provides a much greater level of security. Other forms of authentication that can be used in multi-factor authentication scenarios are things such as what you are or what you do. Now, what you are could be something like a fingerprint, or it could be your face when logging into Windows. Many notebook computers provide built-in cameras, and with the biometrics capability built into Windows 7, you can log in by looking into the camera. Now, as far as something you do is concerned, that could be something like a signature. It's the way that you write your name. So with multi-factor authentication, as long as you're using two or more of the four categories, you can accurately call it multi-factor authentication. Finally, let's talk about BranchCache. BranchCache was introduced with Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008 R2. Regarding Windows 7, it's a feature that can only be taken advantage of in the Ultimate and Enterprise editions. What BranchCache does, ultimately, is speed up access to remote files. For example, let's say that you've downloaded a large file that lives on a company intranet site in a different physical location. Perhaps that other location is a different branch office across the country. If you or another user on your network tries to access the same file, that file will be cached locally. Therefore, so long as the file has not changed at the original location, the file will not need to be downloaded again. Now, there are two basic modes that BranchCache can operate in: distributed mode and hosted mode. In distributed mode, computers on your network share the responsibility of distributing the cached information. That means your client computers are reserving some portion of their hard drive specifically for branch caching. In hosted mode, that means a dedicated server on your local area network is dedicated to branch caching. Let me show you how to configure it. This time I'm going to go to my domain controller. In order to get branch caching working on your file server, you need to install a few things. First, you need to add the BranchCache feature. And then by right-clicking on Features and choose Add Feature. Then you'll need to check BranchCache if it's not already checked, and then install it. Once you're done with that, you'll also need to go under the Roles section and then go to your File Services, and then you'll need to right-click on it and choose Add Role Services. And then you'll also need to make sure BranchCache for network files is installed. Now we're not done. We need to also configure the group policy objects. So let's open up the Group Policy Management Console by typing in gpmc.msc, and let's create a new group policy object for branch caching. Now let's edit this policy. We want to go to Computer Configuration, Policies, Administrative Templates, Network, and then BranchCache. Now first we need to turn on BranchCache. So highlight Turn on BranchCache and then right-click and choose Edit, and then enable it. And then you need to choose whether you want distributed or hosted cache mode. Let's say that we want distributed cache mode. We need to right-click on that and choose Edit, and then enable that as well. Now you can fine-tune other BranchCache settings by setting these group policy objects, but it's not necessary because the defaults will be used if you don't. For more information on the customizations of these settings, you can edit them and then read the text. Now keep in mind that optionally you can create this group policy for a specific organizational unit and not for your entire enterprise. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I'll keep it where it is. So now that we've set up branch caching on the server side, let me show you how to turn it on for a specific share. On my N drive, I've set up a net share. If I right-click on it and choose Properties, and then go to Sharing, and then go to Advanced Sharing, there you'll notice a button called Caching. By clicking on the Caching button, you'll be able to turn on branch caching for this particular share. Now, if you followed my instructions correctly, this particular Enable Branch Caching option will be enabled. Otherwise, it will be grayed out. Now, any of my clients that are configured with this group policy object and which have branch caching enabled and which are accessing this particular network share will be able to take advantage of the branch caching feature. So let's head over to one of our clients. We have to allow branch caching to go through the firewall. Let's take a look at our firewall settings. Under the Allow a Program or Feature through the firewall, you'll find out that branch caching has 4 entries and none of them are checked. But if you're configuring a number of computers, you don't want to do it manually. The easiest way is to go back to the group policy settings on the domain controller. So let's head back over to the domain controller. We're going to open back up that BranchCache GPO, and this time we're going to go to Computer Configuration, Policies, Windows Settings, Security Settings, and then Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, and then expanding it again, we want to choose Inbound Rules. Now first we need to create a firewall rule for HTTP. So we can right-click on Inbound Rules and then choose New Rule. And then I want to choose Predefined. And then I'm going to scroll down to BranchCache, Content Retrieval uses HTTP. And then click Next. And then click Next again. And then I'm going to choose the default, allow the connection, and then click Finish. And then I need to create another inbound rule. So right-click, and then choose New Rule, and then again Predefined. And this time I want to select BranchCache Peer Discovery, uses WSD. and then click Next, Next, and Finish. Now I can customize these rules if I want to by right-clicking on them and then choosing Properties. For example, I can choose only particular computers, I can define the scope based on IP addresses, and I can also specify which profiles and interface types it's bound to. Now I've got to go back to my client again and refresh the group policy. And now that the policy has been updated, let's make sure the branch caching has been turned on. You can do that by using the netsh command. So type in netsh space branch cache followed by another space and then show space status. And you can see here that distributed caching has been turned on by group policy and that the current status is running. Now let's also check out our Windows firewall. Under Allow Programs or Features through the Firewall, we can see that branch cache has been turned on, and also that peer discovery has been turned on as well. These are the two things that we said in the group policy object. So now whenever I access a network share that has branch caching turned on, I'll be able to take advantage of all the benefits that branch caching has to offer. And ultimately, that means much faster downloads from off-site servers. Anyway, that pretty much concludes this screencast. So again, this is Nicholas Hamawi from AGI Training for Microsoft. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.